Professor Norman Fenton, welcome to the Truth Contract.
Yeah, glad to be here. Why not?
Thank you very much indeed for giving up some time. Over the last 3, 4, 5 years, I must have watched 100 interviews around the world that you've given, and I've enjoyed every single one of them. So it's a real pleasure and a privilege for us to have you with us today. And I've got a number of questions I'd like us to go through, 7 questions actually I've put together. So could we start off with, could you please give us a summary of your academic career and your credentials and why you became something, in your own words, of an academic pariah?
Yeah, academic pariah is a bit of an understatement, actually. I got my PhD in maths in 1981, and I've held postdoctoral lectureship and professorship positions at various universities, some quite prestigious, continuously since then. My last academic position was Professor of Risk at Queen Mary, University of London, which I held for 22 years between 2000 and 2022. I'm now officially retired and Professor Emeritus. I've published 7 books, over 350 peer-reviewed papers in different areas of maths, probability, statistics, and computing. I mean, I guess I was considered to be, one of the most high profile and internationally respected researchers in risk assessment, and I'd been an expert witness in multiple criminal and civil cases. But of course, all that changed in 2020 when I began analysing data related to COVID risk. And then I guess I went from Cape Crusader to moustache twirling menace in a single plot twist. So at the time, I was leading a large interdisciplinary project on improving risk assessment and decision making for chronic health conditions. So it was inevitable that I'd be drawn into looking at the COVID data, and I was initially concerned at the wildly pessimistic Imperial College modelling. And we'd also noticed something very strange. Did you know, David, that on the 13th of March 2020, which was the week before first lockdown was announced, the UK government's Advisory Committee on Dangerous Pathogens unanimously decided that COVID was no longer considered a high consequence infectious disease.
I did actually know that, and for other reasons we won't go into, Friday the 13th of March 2020 was
Yeah.
one of the most disastrous days in my career ever.
It's incredible because so few people know that. And of course, what's also interesting is that although it wasn't, the thing about that announcement, the thing about that decision is that it was publicly announced on the Public Health England website on the 19th of March 2020, so 6 days later. And actually it's still there. You can actually see that announcement is still there. It's classified, COVID is not a high consequence infectious disease, 19th of March 2020. And yet incredibly, it was the very next day that Boris Johnson decided to go for full lockdown, something which has never been tried before. So then I, along with colleagues like Martin Neal and Scott McLachlan, were showing that the official data, along with the definitions of what constituted a COVID case and death, were deliberately exaggerating the lethality of COVID. I mean, there was no empirical evidence to support the lockdowns, and even if there were, it was a gross violation of civil liberties. We showed that the PCR tests were hopelessly inaccurate, and they were being used as a tool to create the impression of COVID waves. And of course, later on, we also showed that the vaccines were neither safe nor effective as was claimed. So as a result of that, I was publicly called, all kinds of horrible things. I was publicly called not just a COVID denier and an anti-vaxxer, but a liar, a conspiracy theorist, a fraud, a misinformation merchant. And social media campaigns were mounted against me, some of which were coordinated with the MOD's 77th Brigade, and a lot of them were calling for my dismissal from Queen Mary. And things got even worse when I was invited onto Nigel Farage's show on GB News in December of 2021, where the discussion was primarily about whether the vaccine should be mandated. And I argued then that even if the vaccine was 100% safe and effective, it was morally wrong to enforce a mandate, as this contravened the UNESCO Declaration of Bioethics and Human Rights, of which Great Britain was a signatory. Also, it was also against the Nuremberg Code. And of course, when I then, during that program, I went on to talk about the fact that the vaccine was neither safe nor effective. And Farage actually tried to shut me down at this point, but I kind of got my point across. And after that interview with Farage, the attacks on me got increasingly worse. And basically, they started. I was sort of censored and cancelled. All my papers, even if they weren't about COVID, kind of automatic rejected without review. Colleagues refused to be co-authors on papers with me. They took me off grant applications, and my seminars, which weren't even necessarily about COVID, basically got cancelled.
Very sadly, and your case is well known to me, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of doctors, scientists, epidemiologists, virologists, experts in all sorts of areas all around the world who suffered a similar fate to you and were cancelled and deplatformed. Many doctors were struck off from being doctors, and it was the biggest psyop, I think, in the history of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And those people who said, hang on a minute, you're saying this is the truth, but I'm saying this is the truth, and they can't both be true. And by the way, I've used the scientific method. Let's have a debate and discussion. There was no debate or discussion allowed. It was if anybody who came up with anything that contravened the narrative, they were immediately shut down, deplatformed, silenced, in many cases struck off or debanked.
Yeah. So people never got to know about, or most people never got to know about the research that we and others were doing, which was exposing the fallacies in the narrative that had been presented. And I mean,
How do you feel, Norman, 4 or 5 years later, where there are literally tens of thousands of experts all around the world proving with receipts left, right, and center that it was all the things that you were talking about at the time? Do you feel vindicated, validated?
obviously, if I feel of course, I feel partly vindicated. But even now, I'm still astonished at how most of the so-called normies out there aren't actually aware that that incorrect narrative has actually been debunked so extensively. So you still get people who are quite intelligent people, quite rational people, say things like, well, but the vaccine saved millions of lives.
Mm.
So we still haven't got that there. And yet, on the other hand, you see, the particularly concerning things about this are I've had several vaccine injured people come up to me and say that these are people, for example, who took the vaccine well after we'd already exposed the dangers, the fact that this was not safe and effective as claimed, right? So I'm talking about people relatively young people who first took the vaccine, say at the end of 2021, right? When, that was when they started to push they started to push the vaccine on younger people from the middle of 2021, but people even took it later and got vaccine injured and said if only they'd have known about the things that people like me were saying, they would never have taken it. I mean, that's what really gets me.
And I was talking to someone yesterday, and it's almost unbelievable that in May 2025, despite all of the evidence from all around the world, the NHS is still prescribing COVID boosters and jabs to pregnant women and children.
I know, it's incredible. Although I think that might change soon. Of course, Bobby Kennedy Jr., of course, has announced. Well, it hasn't gone far enough. Of course, he's announced that they will no longer be recommending the COVID vaccines for any healthy people or pregnant women. But
Okay, rather than go down the COVID vaccine rabbit
Yeah,
hole, which we could spend hours down
yeah.
together, I'm sure, I'd like to go back to you have had a remarkably distinguished career, and there is no doubt about it. Until recently, you were widely regarded around the world as a true expert in your specialist field. And at a crucial point in our country's history, a number of expert scientists, professors like yourself, were silenced because what you were raising as questions or concerns wasn't what they wanted the public to know.
Mm-hmm.
And so, with all of that hostility that you encountered after such a long and distinguished career, I think you quit your university position in 2022.
Yeah, the end of December 2022.
So what drove you to do that? I mean, that must have been a horrible end to an amazing career for you.
Yeah, well, yeah, I went quietly into the night. I mean, I wish I could say it was because I won the lottery, but of course it wasn't. Now, I mean, first of all, I should put on the record that I had increasing care commitments to my wife because she has dementia and her condition incidentally rapidly deteriorated after taking 2 doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine against my wishes in 2021. But the primary reason I quit at the end of 2002 was because the university failed to support me against the continuing harassment, the false and frivolous complaints that were being made about me, demands for my dismissal, etc., all of which were complaints about what I was saying about COVID and the vaccines at the time. I got no support from Queen Mary, quite the opposite. So the the HR department kept asking me to respond to those false and frivolous complaints, and they refused my request to make a public statement supporting me about those. There was also a serious incident in which a small group of students went to the head of school, refusing to take my mandatory course at Queen Mary, which is just a course on probabilistic risk assessment. And instead of telling the students where to go, I was told that I was the one who had to change my views. But possibly the final now was when with the university's collusion, my fellowship at the prestigious Alan Turing Institute was revoked, even though I'd also had a key liaison role between Queen Mary and the institute. So those are things that drove me there. But the thing is that I was starting to speak out about issues other than COVID and the vaccines, which were considered to be taboo. So things like, I was speaking out about my concerns about climate change, net zero, WF, the corruption of academia, and especially things like the DEI. And so it was clear that if I was going to speak about those things, my employment with the university, incidentally, even though I was only ever part-time professor at Queen Mary, wasn't going to be tenable. So, I mean, I can give you another example of the sort of thing that was happening then. Although this particular thing happened after my resignation, it does kind of perfectly exemplify what I was up against. So I'd been invited to be a keynote speaker at a major NHS conference on the use of AI in medicine. It was actually June 2023. And the talk had nothing to do with COVID. It was just about the work I'd done in using Bayesian probability for improving medical decision making. And shortly before, just I think a week before the event, I got an email saying the following. I'll just read it out. I'm sorry to say that the conference organising committee has just been alerted to the controversy around vaccinations on your Twitter account and fear that this may distract from the conference. They've asked that we not proceed with your talk on Bayesian networks. This is very unfortunate given your expertise in the subject area. Now, I submitted a subject access request to the NHS asking for all the internal email correspondence relating to my cancellation. And I eventually got 17 heavily redacted documents back. And some of the non-redacted material showed that the people on the program committee, or some of the people on the program committee, considered me to be a dangerous anti-vaxxer whose appearance would discredit the NHS and even encourage vaccine hesitancy. Now, the Free Speech Union took up my case and submitted a judicial review on my behalf. It turned out that it was too late for technical reasons to submit the judicial review. But the NHS lawyers submitted a very long and absolutely incredible response. So, for example, in that, I mean, obviously they claim that I was maintained an active profile on Twitter as a controversialist, right? But I'll read out something else, which is comes directly, if I can find it here, directly from their statement. It said, Fenton regularly ends his tweets about COVID with the clown emoji followed by the world emoji, meaning clown world. This is an alt-right internet meme, which is also known as the Heil Honkler sign, which is an American white supremacist movement sign, meaning where honk means Hitler. It's a dog whistle, conveying that the left have created a clown war. So they're essentially accusing me of being a Hitler supporter, just for putting the clown world emojis at the end, with which I had no idea. I mean, did you have any idea this was apparently synonymous with with the white supremacist movement, and was a dog whistle for Heil Hitler? Did you know that?
No, I didn't. But
I mean, it's bizarre. It's actually,
let me just jump in here quickly and ask you
yeah.
a supplementary question. So you've been involved in academia for decades and decades. And when was it that you realized that you weren't allowed to be yourself? Because presumably for decades you were.
Actually, it started to change after I did it was when I really did the BBC documentary on climate change by numbers in 2015. I mean,
Right.
I'd already
I've got
look.
a question about that
Oh,
later.
okay. So we'll come on to that. Okay, it was.
But
I think that from about
a long and distinguished career, which presumably for a huge chunk of it, you were being yourself
yeah.
and doing your thing, and no one objected, and everyone actually appreciated it. Hence your followership and expertise, reputation. But it's almost like there was a turning point where
I think the turning point was probably it's sort of early 2000 when it became clear to me. I mean, let me put this on record. I myself was a former person from the left, like a lot of academics. You could even say from the far left. I think in my youth, I was a member of the International Socialists, which became the Socialist Workers' Party. And I was a member of the Labour Party, believe it or not, until I think as recently as might have even been as recently as 2014, right? But long before I left the Labour Party, from about early 2000, I realised how corrupt most of the establishment left was, and in particular, I became fully aware, kind of like been aware of it in my early youth, of the extent to which it was all about indoctrinating people. And I became really aware of how much that far left cultural Marxist movement had basically captured the universities. And so I felt that as I was moving away from that kind of like whole Marxist thought and moving towards more kind of like conservative, what would be considered to be more right-wing views, I say, although I never consider myself to be a right-winger. I've always considered myself to be, liberal and open-minded and, believer in free speech and, human rights, civil liberties. And I basically felt that the far left in academia totally dominated all the key positions, were against all of that. They, contrary to what people think, most academics don't believe in free speech. They believe in censorship. They only believe in civil liberties for people who think the same way as them, and that's increasingly only people with far left views. So I was already concerned, and I already felt that I couldn't really speak up. So I felt a little bit constrained, but I wasn't speaking up publicly. So I wasn't actually doing anything or saying anything until much later, that there was this, that I felt that there was maybe people became suspicious of me not being part of the in crowd, not being part of that accepted far left academic clique,
Can
which
I ask
dominates
you
everything.
a very personal question? And by the way, I'm relating this to lots of other guests that I've interviewed who got to around about 70 and they'd been in the medical profession or this profession or that. And it was only towards the end of their career where they felt, well, I've got my pension and I can retire now and blah, 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 that actually I'm going to speak out. And I just wonder, and they're honest about it, and they're like, I wish I'd
Yeah,
spoken up earlier, but I had a mortgage
yeah,
to pay or my pension to top up.
yeah,
And the system made it very difficult for them to question COVID jabs or whatever it was
yeah.
at the beginning. Was this, have you encountered the same?
Oh, absolutely. And I suppose to a certain extent, I'm sort of guilty of it. So, for example, even before COVID, I had very serious concerns about the whole climate change narrative, and I realized that I couldn't speak up. I couldn't speak out very vehemently because I knew that that would be considered to be something which was unacceptable. And to be perfectly frank, at that point, I was a little scared about, my career. To a certain extent, when I started on the COVID stuff, I didn't realize, I genuinely didn't realize for that first year that it would be considered completely controversial.
Yes, I think
It
lots.
was only when other academics were saying things like the lockdowns are fantastic because it's going to reduce carbon emissions and it's going to be fantastic and we should be having these forever. And it was only when and academics at the same time I saw were censoring people who were coming out against the official COVID narrative. It was only then I realized that I was going to be the target of that censorship cancellation campaign. And at that point, the question is, would I have carried on as vehemently if I was, say, in my early stage of my career, mid 40s or whatever, rather than at the time, what was that? At the time I was 64, 65. I don't know. I might well have been too scared. I mean, I have close colleagues who have supported a lot of what I've done, but have not come out very publicly and made the kind of statements I've made. Other people haven't said anything at all, haven't done any work, but have privately said to me, they totally, very senior and incredibly influential academics, not many, but a few have said, told me in private that they fully support what I'm doing, but there's no way they could come out publicly to support me because it would basically end their careers. It's
Yeah,
that serious. So yes, to a certain extent, okay, I mean, as I say, I was only part-time at Queen Mary. I've got my own. I've had for a long time been involved in a software company, doing risk assessment stuff like that. So I had that kind of that as a sort of a cushion, and I was nearing the age where I could take my pension, and so I kind of like felt yes, I could go for it, and I kind of realised, within that between 21 and 22 that I would be forced out whether I well voluntarily or not. So yes, you're absolutely right to ask those questions, and I would have to say hand on heart, I probably wouldn't have been as brave as people think I might have been had I not been at that age.
it's over the last few months or 6 months or so, I've ended up mentoring 3 medical experts around the world, all of whom are going through striking off procedures. But all of they've done is come out and say the
Yeah.
stuff that Pierre Corey, Dr. David Martin, or whoever have been pointing out for years. So anyway, I've got another question I want us to jump into. You recently signed an open letter along with some other academics that criticized the idea that conformance to DEI principles must be a key criteria for gaining government research funding. Can you tell me what that was all about and why you signed it?
Yeah, but actually, first of all, I just want to say something about the whole obsession with that DEI, which is diversity, equity, inclusion in academia, because that's another reason, actually, why I quit. Because DEI, I mean, DEI, I can't remember, this was possibly sort of American academics said this, I'm sort of paraphrasing somebody else here, but DEI looks like it's about race and gender, but it's actually about class. It's about keeping working class people and working class values out so that the elites can have a monopoly. And DEI lets basically rich liberals pillage the middle class while pretending to be heroes saving us all from racism. Anyway, but I think that DEI policies have destroyed community cohesion and introduced the most outrageous discrimination against especially, but not exclusively, white British males. And in the university, barely a day went by where I wasn't spammed with DEI nonsense and bureaucratic obligations which were demanding subservience to it, having to write reports justifying what I'm doing to support DEI in my research, in projects, etc. And so I think that everything about DEI is not just an enormous waste of resources, but has had the opposite effect of what was intended. I'll just give you just one small example of that, is that every so often we were mandated to attend things like unconscious bias training. And yet, a colleague of mine, Magda Osman, has actually proven that that unconscious bias training not only achieves nothing, but it's counterproductive. It has usually the opposite effect that's intended. So going on to this open letter, it was about the Research Excellence Framework, the REF. And that's the mechanism by which the government allocates around £2 billion a year in research funding to academic institutions. And every few years, each university has to make a case for the quality of its research by providing evidence of published papers and research projects that have achieved high impact. That's the REF, that's the so-called REF exercise. Now, it's never been perfect, but at least to, more or less, research excellence was the sole factor in determining who got how much funding. However, what they've basically done is that they've made this announcement for the next REF, which is 2019. They announced that a full 25% of the funding would be based on universities' commitments to DEI policies rather than their research excellence. And what this letter did, it's been signed by I was quite amazed actually how many, I think it's something like 200 professors or whatever in the UK have actually come out and signed this. Of course, this is a tiny fraction. They really still don't only represent a tiny fraction of academics. But nevertheless, I was pleasantly surprised at how many were prepared to come out and challenge this. This is the sort of the one thing you're not allowed to, one of the things you're absolutely not normally allowed to question. They've done it publicly, which is very good. And in the statement, explain why there was no coherent justification provided for any of this, and the letter ended by saying that these proposals pose serious risks to research integrity and quality, to academic freedom, and to institutional autonomy and diversity. So, the thing is, I also believe that DEI policies are the inevitable result of the cultural Marxists, sort of what's been called the long march through the institutions, and that was always focused on the universities, because once you indoctrinate university students with this stuff, then it's the elite students who eventually go on to all the key positions in politics, media, and the law, as well as the key positions in universities. The whole thing is self-perpetuating. And most people have no idea of just how corrupt and dysfunctional academia really is, because it's so totally dominated by people with extreme leftist authoritarian views who deny open discussion and dissent. And I mean, I think that the most prominent and influential specialist academics are essentially political activists over and above their specialist area. And you can see this is especially true in climate change research.
Can I
So
just pause a second before we go on to climate change?
yeah,
This one. So over the last few months, I can think of, and I want to make sure I've understood the examples correctly. I think it was a Yorkshire police force basically said that they weren't recruiting any white males.
yep, yep,
And also the Air Force weren't accepting any applications to become
yep,
pilots from white males.
yep.
And so that was DEI in action,
Oh yeah, of
but
course.
but actually it's racist against white people.
Oh, and you cannot believe that the extent to which this happens in with university
So
appointments.
I want
There
to
are so many scholarships and studentships and also lectureships and even professorships which essentially prohibit applications from white males and focus on
what's happened in Britain to meritocracy then?
it's, as I said, this is the end result of cultural Marxism. They want to destroy the existing, what was I guess the traditional it's meritocracy. That's what it's all about.
So I'm only a couple of years younger than you, but I left school in 1977, and basically we were told you can be anything you want as long as you work hard.
Yeah, not anymore. Yeah.
And also, we had any field you could go into, you could go. There was no restrictions on anything as long as you worked hard. Um, all right, so you've also been involved in a long-running saga trying to get the data that they hold about the COVID vaccine safety out of the Medical Health Regulatory Agency, the MHRA.
Yeah.
Can you summarize what that was about and why it makes you so concerned about the MHRA, the Medical Health
Oh
Regulatory?
yeah, because this actually all kicked off in November 2022 when June Rain, who's the CEO of MHRA, gave a speech in which she not only stated that MHRA was transforming from a regulator to an enabler of the pharma industry, but she also spoke about the yellow card scheme and its role in monitoring COVID vaccine safety. Now, for people who don't know, the yellow card scheme is the voluntary scheme that anybody can, with actually great difficulty, go online and register any adverse reactions they get from any vaccines, not just COVID vaccines. But she spoke about what was called the I think it's called the yellow card vaccine monitoring scheme. And this was an active monitoring scheme. Yeah, it's called the yellow card. The yellow card vaccine monitor. This was an active monitoring scheme for which they'd managed to recruit 30,000 volunteers who were going to actively report any vaccine adverse reactions from the COVID vaccines, in particular. They were recruited and in December 2020 when the vaccine rollout started. And she said that, for example, this included 2,000 pregnant women. And the problem is that while the MHA were publishing the general yellow card data, the voluntary stuff, they hadn't published anything about this monitor scheme. And of course, this was now November 2022 when she was speaking about it. It started in December 2020. So they should have had this data on this safety data, proper active monitoring safety data on these 30,000 volunteers, including the 2,000 pregnant women, but there was nothing out there. So people had submitted FOI requests after she made this after she had this speech, which they eventually reluctantly replied to with a redacted report, which was marked not for publication. And it was a report that they had submitted to the Pharmacovigilance Expert Advisory Group in June 2021. So all of this had been hidden from the public. And although that report didn't provide any detailed data, it showed there were some incredibly alarming safety signals. So, for example, 53% of all of those in the monitor had reported at least one adverse drug reaction from the COVID vaccines. Nearly 60% of people who got the AstraZeneca vaccine, for example, reported at least one adverse event, and 40% Pfizer, nearly 60% Moderna, right? But of the pregnant women, for example, who'd received the AstraZeneca vaccine, a whopping 66% reported at least one adverse reaction, and there was nearly 40% for Pfizer, the pregnant women, and over 60% also for the Moderna recipients. Now, because that report was written in June 2021, it didn't yet contain any information, or almost minimal information, about pregnancy outcomes. I think at that point only 6 births in total had been recorded by the end of June 2021. So because of the obvious safety signals in that report, Cheryl Granger submitted an FOI to the MHRA with 9 specific questions, specifically about the pregnancy outcomes data in that report. And the MHR responded by saying, well, yeah, they did have all the answers to her questions, but they couldn't release that data publicly because it was, well, they actually said that they used this so-called, I think it's called a Section 22 exemption, whereby they can say they don't have to release the data until it's submitted in a peer-reviewed report. And so Cheryl asked them to review that decision, and they refused again, stressing the fact that they weren't going to reveal anything until it was eventually published in a peer-reviewed journal. Of course, there was no timescales on this, and there was no guarantee it was ever going to be published in a peer-reviewed journal. So what Cheryl did, she appealed to the Information Commissioner's Office, and after a lengthy delay, the ICO looked at MHA's response to them and upheld their decision. It was completely bizarre, actually, what the MHRA said, because they said that the disclosure of that data and answers to what they called narrow questions in isolation, and without a full disclosure of the method, blah, 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 could lead to unnecessary concerns on the safety of vaccination within a vulnerable population. In other words, they were specifically saying that their data clearly had major safety signals, because otherwise they wouldn't be saying that it would, if it was let out, it would lead to, vaccine hesitancy. So Cheryl appealed the ICO decision, and it went to a tribunal, which I was asked to be an expert witness for. And after the deadline set for submitting evidence to tribunal, just to show how, maliciously the MHRA were behaving in this whole event, they actually produced a preprint paper which they claimed provided the answer to Cheryl's 9 questions. But the problem was it didn't, and it came too late for us to challenge it in the tribunal. Now, luckily, the judge in the tribunal, which was Judge Moan, actually adjourned that first tribunal because she felt that that their evidence had been submitted too late. But she made it clear that when the tribunal adjourned, which was in February this year, it couldn't address the issue of safety of the vaccines. So it had to focus only on why the MHRA preprint didn't address the 9 questions. And my report for the second tribunal did focus on that. It's explained in detail why the questions weren't answered, and the MHRA lawyers didn't cross-examine me or any of the other witnesses that Cheryl had got, but they simply maintained they provided all the data they could without infringing on participant confidentiality. So they used confidentiality as a reason why they couldn't really reveal it all. And unfortunately, the judge eventually issued a ruling dismissing Cheryl's appeal. The whole thing, absolutely astonishing.
This is yet another example in this country of a Quango,
Yep,
a non-elected, appointed body to whom Parliament has outsourced decision
exactly.
making. And very worryingly, I think, the MHRA gets over 80% of its funding from the very people and companies that it's supposed to be protecting us from.
Exactly, which was
So,
why, incidentally, June Raines said they were wanting to move to be an enabler rather than a regulator
yes,
of the
but
pharma
so what
industry.
could possibly go wrong if the medical health regulatory authorities funders are the drug companies that they're protecting us from? I can't
Exactly,
see any problem
exactly.
in that at all. And it's like Ofcom getting all of its funding from the BBC or
Yeah.
all of
Well,
these.
yeah, but it's interesting you said, because Ofcom is another example of a quango. I mean, since Tony Blair basically came to power in '97, they've created thousands, haven't they, of these
No,
quangos?
it's just over 500, I think.
Oh, is it? Is it? Okay, but they're all of course staffed with exactly the type of cultural Marxists, as I mentioned, who've come out of the university system. I mean, that really is the case.
I, that may well be the case. I haven't studied enough, but what I have studied is where does the funding come from for these regulatory agencies that are supposed to be protecting us? And what is shocking is the percentage of funding, and the MHRA, your
Yeah,
existing example, is supposed to be protecting the NHS and us, the patient, from unscrupulous pharmaceutical companies.
yeah,
Yet 84 or 85% of the funding is coming from the very companies that they're trying to. So the conflicts of interest are shocking.
yep, yep,
And we could extend the same conversation, I think, to the World Health Organization, where it gets its funding from. And so,
yep.
okay, let's go. You mentioned this earlier, but I had another question for you. In 2015, you co-presented a BBC documentary called Climate Change by Numbers, which I know ended up being a pivot point for you. So how did that experience influence your views about climate change and net zero?
Look, I was a little bit skeptical about climate change before that, but they didn't know that. In fact, they approached me. I was actually auditioned, believe it or not, for the role because they were looking for mathematicians who hadn't been involved in the climate change debate, and they wanted them to explain some of the crucial numbers surrounding climate change. And in the end, they chose me along with Hannah Fry and Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter to be the three co-presenters. We each had 30-minute slot in what was basically a 90-minute documentary. And the fact that Hannah Fry and David Spiegelhalter have gone on to become extremely high-profile science presenters for the BBC. In fact, I mean, Hannah Fry is essentially the face of BBC Science now. That in contrast to them, my TV career started and ended with that documentary, which I believe was essentially a pure propaganda piece. Gives you some indication of what my feelings were about it, because working on it revealed to me just how biased and corrupt the whole climate change industry is, including especially the academics, of course, involved in it, but not just those. And in particular, how compromised the academics are. Now, at that time, the BBC hadn't yet officially announced the policy, which was to not allow climate skeptics to appear on any of its programs because the science was settled. They did actually eventually announce that policy 2 years later, but the producer of the documentary had made it clear to us from the start that the documentary couldn't include any kind of skeptical content. Now, what I was supposed to explain on the program was how the IPCC determined that it was 95% certain, that was my number, 95% certain that most of the recent warming was down to humans. Now, in fact, I looked at the IPCC reports and their models, and the IPCC models definitely didn't show that, didn't claim that number.
They
It was
didn't
actually only in the 2013 summary report when that was stated. It wasn't in the full report, and in fact, putting that number in the summary was just a classic probability fallacy. It's called the fallacy of the transposed conditional. You don't need to know about it here, but the point is, the filming for Climate Change by Numbers took place over 6 months, and there was actually a few days, entire days filming, when I tried to put my own explanation about why that was wrong, why there was a fallacy involved there. But of course, none of that made it into the final edit. The only stuff that made it into the final edit was stuff that was scripted, all scripted by external consultants, right? And after the program went out, I made a formal complaint about the way the program was edited, and I was especially motivated to complain about a particular statement that I was asked to make about the accuracy of the models, because I was very unhappy about that. I was very uncomfortable because I didn't think it was true what was being stated. So I actually called the professor who was the expert consultant and said to him, "Look, I'm uncomfortable about this. Is it really okay to say this in the program?" And he said, "Absolutely. I can assure you, absolutely, that is fine. You're able to say that. It's absolutely correct, right?" Now, after the program went out, I found out that that same professor had very recently published a paper contradicting exactly what he'd told me to, scripted me to say. So I called him up and I asked him about this. And what do you think his response was?
I've got new information and I've changed my mind.
No, he didn't. He said, we all have to lie for the greater good.
No, I was being sarcastic.
Oh, right.
Because
actually they do. Well, okay, what often happens if you get confronted with this, they say they don't say they've changed their mind, they've got new information where I might have phrased it differently or something like that, they'll say. But no, he said it was.
There is no phrase that upsets me more than the science is settled. It's like, that's an oxymoron. Science is never settled. If you've got new information, you can change your mind. But I think this is really interesting because, again, it's coming back to lots of things we've talked about already. But essentially, he was really saying there is a narrative, there is an agenda that has been agreed upon. And whether it's right or wrong, it doesn't matter. It's been agreed upon. And we've all got to go along with it, regardless of someone turning up and saying, well, that can't be true if this is true.
Yeah, absolutely. And once you create that narrative, you get to things like the whole net zero thing, which I think is, of course, that's all based on the climate change scam. And
it is, but in a way, rather than go down the net zero rabbit hole, which I'm sure we could talk about for hours too, the point you just made is really important. And I'd like us to unpack that a little bit, that there is a narrative which has been agreed about COVID jabs, about net zero, about lots of things, about Bovair, about geoengineering, about fluoride in the water. There's lots and lots of things that a narrative has been agreed. And, here's what the narrative is. Here's what the government or the Quangos are saying. But thousands, hundreds of doctors, experts turn up and say, well, no, actually, here's the truth. And they can't both be true. Yet the people presenting alternative views, alternative news and information are silenced, censored, shut down. And so you've experienced this with your BBC climate story, with the MHRA. It's almost like every story you've told in our conversation today has been how, well, I had some information, detailed analysis, peer-reviewed, that I wanted to share because there was an alternative point of view to the narrative, but you weren't allowed to share it or you were punished.
Yeah. Well, can I let you into a dirty little secret here? Because
Yes.
again, this is something that
The
not many
two of
people
us.
know, right? I mean, everybody, you're aware, you've implied it there, that the people who control the narrative, as it were, have control over all the sort of the mainstream media, newspapers, etc. And also, as we found out, before Elon Musk came in and got Twitter, they had total control over, the social media, the search platforms, and you know, and things like Facebook, and which they still have control over, and also Twitter, now X, right? Well, I can tell you, it goes. It's this is this. I can. The dirty little secret is that the massive, almost all of the massive investments that have been made in AI research in academia and elsewhere in the last few years has basically been research into censorship and clever algorithms to not just, sorry, censorship to create, to bolster the narrative, and to basically um, uh, remove the voices of those who challenge the narrative. It's basically, it's all about clever algorithms to do censorship. That's what virtually all of the AI funding is. And so actually, I see this as getting much worse, because you only have to even something like Grok, right, which is, on it, which, is part of X, that's their AI machine. You can see how it's been trained to basically promote the official narrative on anything, and to demote. And you won't find, if you go through that, you won't find the reports and all of the other material from, as you say, from these thousands of people who've challenged the narrative. It's basically written out of history, and it will increasingly be written out of history. It's truly Orwellian.
I have direct experience of that in the last week or so, because one of the topics that we've unpacking and exploring in the Truth Contract is about Beauvais. And I inserted lots and lots of research into one of the AI platforms, and it asked it a question, and it came back with well, this is all a good thing because it's going to reduce methane emissions and help with net zero.
Mhm.
And I went back and said, your reply is very biased. And can you please remove from your reply that connection with that? Because I'm only interested in the animal's safety and the damage to their gut. And eventually, after pushing and pushing and pushing back, I eventually got a non-biased answer. But it's like, wow, I spent an hour and a half
Yeah.
fighting with the AI for it to eliminate its bias. So going back to everything we've talked
And
about.
incidentally, I can tell you there are plenty of people working on stopping people like you doing that and exposing it in the end as well, in AI field.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So everything we've talked about is going to end up where AI ultimately is being pushed to create a censorship cage around everybody, that they will only be fed with information that's approved.
Yeah, and of course Ofcom, you mentioned Ofcom before. I mean, they're in the UK, of course, aren't they going to give Ofcom the powers to censor the internet as well as TV and radio?
Yes, and I know a number of podcast hosts are now worried about Ofcom
Yep.
having jurisdiction over them. And of course, I'm sure the Truth Contract over the years will have the same concerns as well. But we are going to push on until something like that happens,
Yeah.
because there are so many people in the UK. To me, there's a group of people who seem to control everything at the moment, but they're so out of touch with um, what Matthew Goodwin calls the alarm clock class. They set an alarm clock, get up in the morning, go to work, and the voiceless British people. And more and more people are waking up to the fact there's something not quite right. I'm not sure if I'm being told true. And we've done a whole bunch of work over the last few months going to the polls and surveys of British attitudes towards MPs, whether they tell the truth or not, the establishment, whether it's, looking after everybody or looking after a few. 41% of people in the UK believe that the system is completely broken and needs to be replaced with a new system. So it feels to me, which is why we're doing this, that there is a huge groundswell of people saying, this isn't working, it's not right, it's not fair, it's taking us in the wrong direction. And there's a tiny group of people who have created this system who are going to find it harder and harder to cling on to control without things like AI being used for the wrong purposes to brainwash people. So I also, like you've said, see this as a continuing threat that could get worse and worse and worse if it's not stopped. And you've talked throughout the conversation about how this is an agenda, a sort of Fabian society agenda, a Marxist socialist agenda. So if it's okay, I'm going to bring all this conversation to a close.
Yep.
Because what I've learned is throughout your career, and particularly the last 10, 15 years, whether it was climate change or COVID or the MHRA, whatever, you have been shut down and silenced and censored and deplatformed for saying, excuse me, that can't be true because this is true.
Mm-hmm.
And all you've done is you provided evidence and all sorts of, proof of what you were saying, but what you were saying wasn't acceptable. And so if there's one thing that we should all be doing to turn the tide against this new world order of control, censorship, surveillance, social credit scores, no doubt CBDCs and all the rest of it, what would that one thing be?
Well, a lot of people in my position might say something like tear up the sort of the net zero agenda, but that might slow down the sort of move towards a sort of this new world order or globalist kind of like new world order, but it'd be only a temporary fix to the problem. I think I've indicated that the core of all of these problems comes in academia, right? I mean, I think it was Brett Weinstein in an interview that I did with him who said, academia is like a rabid dog. There's no saving it. I mean, I think it should be put down, but that's clearly not an easy thing that can happen. But I think the one key step that would help move towards that situation and getting hold of that, which from which you get all of the censorship, indoctrination, etc., and all of the globalist control. The one thing I would do is basically close down the whole of the DEI program. I mean, as Trump did in the US, make it illegal in government institutions. Because I think once you've basically destroyed that whole DEI narrative, that is a key step to freeing universities from that trap, and hence eventually all of society from cultural Marxism.
About a year and a half ago, I made a pitch. I was invited to go and make a pitch to a university on the outskirts of London, which is near to where I grew up. And at the end of 3 or 4 hour meetings, I ended up, I think it was almost like the worst meeting I've ever been to, because I realized that the system was completely broken.
Yep.
And that they weren't preparing young people for a world of work and the future. And it was a very depressing meeting. But I think that surely if we just scrap DEI, if we don't replace it with meritocracy is In other words, you can't just take something away, you've got to replace it with something. It's like, what's happened to make Britain great again? And we want the best people with the best talents, and we want the cream to rise to the top of the milk bottle always. Um, and and I don't think anybody I know cares whether you're this religion or that religion, or this color or that color. But we've all gone way past, or if you're straight or gay or whatever, no one cares anymore.
Yeah,
But what
absolutely.
they do care about is, you get the job done,
Yeah,
and you work hard, and you're committed to working in part of the team and getting your. I mean, the Truth Contract is a startup, and I love this. But the four of us, there are three part-time people, and I'm pretty full-time. The average age is 60. And we're all doing this because we want to restore Britain and other countries around the world back to where it was hopeful and it was a positive outlook for the future, rather than the terminal decline that we've ended up with. Norman, we could chat for hours and hours, and I know I'd love every minute of the conversation. I know you're a busy chap with caring duties and other things. I would love to have another conversation with you in a few months' time, and I can't thank you enough for giving up your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure for me to interview you. Lots of great things have come out of the conversation, which I think my summary is, it doesn't matter whether it's COVID or net zero or whatever. There is information which the powers that be have, which they don't allow the public to ever know about.
yep,
And the people who are not allowing us to find out about it are controlled by the very organizations that they're there to protect us from. It's hardly a surprise that we're in this
yep.
situation.
I
But
think that's a
that's
good
what
summary, and it's been great to be on your show.